January 2023 sees the release of the first new Dead Space game in almost a decade, a remake of the original title from 2008. In the years following Dead Space 3's release, fans have been clamouring for a new game, but publisher EA have not shown any interest in meeting those demands, owing to what it saw as disappointing sales numbers and a lack of interest in the survival genre as a whole. So why have EA decided now is the time to test the waters with Dead Space again? And more significantly, could this remake revive the franchise? To understand just how we've got here, we'll briefly delve into the history of the Dead Space franchise, to see why the series rose, then promptly fell, and the gaming industry's relationship with the survival horror genre as a whole. Developed by what was known as EA Redwood Shores at the time, and headed up by industry leads Glenn Schofield and Michael Condrey, the game was intended to be the most terrifying and gruesome title the team could create. You play as Isaac Clarke, an engineer investigating the disappearance of his girlfriend aboard the USG Ishimura, a ship which has been plagued by an invasion of the undead alien necromorphs. Dead Space came with some pretty innovative ideas. The usual HUD elements like health and ammo were incorporated into the game world itself. Your health bar was a coloured meter on the spine of your spacesuit, and ammo counts were displayed on your weapons. The world used procedural generation to place enemy locations and trigger lighting and audio cues, meaning you could never fully predict what would be in the next room, even if you'd already been in it before. And enemies could be dismembered to incapacitate them, making hordes of necromorphs easier to handle with some strategic thinking. Immersion was the priority, with design decisions focused on drawing the player into the setting, creating an atmosphere of tension before hitting them with some of the big shocks. The game was released to critical acclaim and won several awards, but initial sales figures failed to reflect this, shifting just under 200,000 units in its first week. However, the game would go on to sell over 1 million copies by 2009, as word of mouth spread about this unusual and terrifying new title. EA eventually saw the game as enough of a success to action a sequel, turning Redwood Shores into a new studio called Visceral Games, and their sole focus would be horror titles. 3 years later, Dead Space 2 appeared on shelves with a heavier focus on action and combat, though still retaining some of the horror aspects that made the original unique. New features included destructible environments, scenery that could be used as projectiles, and a separate multiplayer mode. The game was a hit, surpassing the original in both critical acclaim and sales figures. However, some fans saw the shift of tone as damaging to what made the original so good. Publisher EA commented on being unhappy at the game's sales figures of around 2 million copies in its first week, and Visceral stated the changes some fans were upset with were as a result of listening to feedback and tweaking the game based on suggestions. However, others weren't so sure, and wondered whether the publisher was interfering, insisting on things that would make the game sell more copies by following industry trends. By doing this, Visceral and EA were heading down a rabbit hole that would lead to the death of the franchise. EA wanted Dead Space 3 to make even more money and have higher sales. They pressured Visceral to include features hitherto unseen in the franchise. Dead Space 3 was to be co-op focused. The game featured the return of Isaac Clarke, as well as a second protagonist, John Carver. In fact, Dead Space 3 is basically designed for co-op, meaning playing the game alone was discouraged owing to enemy balance and level design. Also gone was the intense atmosphere and creeping dread of previous games, replaced with high-octane set pieces such as a fight on a high-speed train and a shootout on an exploding space station. But the most dramatic change was the introduction of microtransactions. Nowadays, most games include in-game purchases in one form or another, but at the time these were relegated to free-to-play or mobile titles. But EA wanted the game to make more money, and so forced Visceral to shoehorn them into their game. And shoehorn they certainly did. Whilst purchasing crafting resources was technically optional, it required a huge amount of grinding to avoid them. Funny thing is, at the time, players genuinely thought that this was a glitch rather than a design choice. Such was the shock of them being used in this way. In just 2 games, Dead Space went from an intense, isolated survival horror that was genuinely unique and terrifying to a co-op action game with cinematic set pieces and in-game purchases. No wonder series fans hated it, and no wonder it didn't sell. Dead Space 3 sold around 600,000 copies in North America in its first week, a figure apparently so low EA refused to publish the overall sales numbers at all. Reviewers were particularly critical of the inclusion of microtransactions, as well as the loss of what made the original game so unique by homogenizing the gameplay in line with every other third-person cover shooter at the time. EA came out trying to justify the changes in Dead Space 3 by claiming that the franchise was too scary to be single-player, and people felt far more comfortable playing it with someone else than they did doing it on their own. Yes, that's right. EA was claiming that Visceral, the team they tasked with making scary games, had made games that were too scary. In fact, people only really like these kinds of games if there's someone else there, or if they can buy their way out of trouble. The mental gymnastics on display here are second to none. It was clear that the publisher was making excuses for why they'd butted their noses in and forced Visceral to throw away Dead Space's identity in search of profits. Much like the Necromorphs, EA had severed the franchise limb from limb, leaving it a husk of what it once was. Dead Space 3 was to be the final game in the series, as EA cancelled any future sequels. Just a few years later, Visceral took a stab at creating a game in the Battlefield series, Hardline. After this failed to wow anyone, the company was shut down in 2017 too. In the early 2010s, gamers were being told that no one was interested in survival horror games anymore, and that was why Dead Space 3 supposedly failed. Certainly this is what the big AAA publishers believed, as horror franchises were being mutated, transformed and killed off in their droves. Just look at what happened to Resident Evil. 4 could be considered the height of the franchise, but just 2 games later and the series was stripped of all that made it special. Silent Hill had tried to emulate the tense psychological horror of Silent Hill 2 with subsequent titles, but Konami basically gave up on the franchise by the 2010s in favour of pachinko machines and the world's second favourite football game. And as for Dead Space, it has seemingly been left to gather dust, and EA doubled down on its policy of microtransactions with its sports franchises, as well as more controversially with other single-player games too. It seemed for many publishers that horror games just couldn't be justified financially. There was too small of an audience to warrant developing scary games, and that wasn't what gamers wanted anymore. But was that actually true? Of course not. And it took the ever-burgeoning indie scene to prove that people still wanted to be scared. In 2012, a little-known developer called Mark J. Hadley released Slender, the 8 pages, for free online. The player would go in search of 8 pages in a dark forest whilst being followed by the titular Slender Man, who resembled a faceless Peter Crouch Men in Black agent. Because the title was free, and the character was based on an internet meme from the Something Awful forum, word of mouth spread about this intense, terrifying little game, leading to millions of people, including many non-gamers, experiencing it for themselves. It also exploded on the ever-growing video platform YouTube and the newly named streaming site Twitch.tv. Remember, this is 2012, with Let's Plays featuring people scared out of their wits and screaming at jump scares. These videos garnered millions of views, as well as being the ultimate marketing tool for games that did not have the budget of AAA publishers. Other smaller developed games such as Amnesia: The Dark Descent, Outlast, and Five Nights at Freddy's subsequently had a similar rise in prominence, owing to YouTube and Twitch. And it was becoming increasingly evident that the market for horror games wasn't just alive, but it was growing rapidly. But it wasn't until the back end of the 2010s that AAA publishers started answering the calls for new, big-budget horror experiences to match this uptick in demand. In 2017, Capcom released Resident Evil 7: Biohazard, a phenomenal game that reinvented the Resi formula by introducing a first-person perspective. Dark Souls creators From Software introduced players to Lovecraftian horror with their PS4 exclusive Bloodborne. And Arcane's 2017 reboot of the Prey franchise made even the objects around you a potentially terrifying prospect in the form of the Mimic enemies. It was no surprise then when publisher EA and Dead Space's original creator Glenn Schofield announced they'd be working on new AAA survival horror games. Though not quite as you'd expect. For one thing, they weren't working together on them at all. No, they'd gone their separate ways, and now there were 2 separate projects on the table.
You've obviously heard the news by now, but I wanted to formally introduce myself. I'm Glenn Schofield, the head of our new development studio called Striking Distance.
Schofield had created a new company, Striking Distance Studios, and announced their debut title, The Callisto Protocol, in 2020. to be a spiritual successor to the Dead Space franchise. It was released in December 2022 to mixed reviews, with praise going to its atmosphere, art and sound design, but critical of its combat and narrative. Meanwhile, EA announced they'd be publishing a complete remake of the original Dead Space game from the ground up, to be released the month after Callisto in January 2023. The remake would stick to the original story and gameplay structure, but feature redesigned assets, character models and environment, as well as enhanced audio design and the complete removal of loading screens. In many ways, this makes sense for the publisher, who are clearly still nervous about the franchise from a financial standpoint. None of the Dead Space games sold especially well on launch, and the idea of investing tens of millions of dollars on something that hasn't seen a new game in a decade may not be as prudent as rebuilding an already existing game to sell to new fans as well as old. But will a Dead Space remake sell better than the original? And will there be enough new fans coming in to revitalise the franchise and perhaps lead to a brand new entry in the series? There are many reasons to be optimistic. The game will certainly be the perfect place for new players to be introduced to the franchise who may have passed in it before, or simply been too young. Returning fans will also be excited to see a favourite game reimagined and rejuvenated in this way. And most importantly of all, single-player horror games have proven to be popular and have proven to sell, certainly more significantly than they used to. Perhaps it may still end up being too niche a game for EA standards. It'll never have the broad appeal of Star Wars, FIFA or The Sims, nor can it be as aggressively monetized. But of any horror game, a remake of Dead Space might just do well enough to prick up their ears and commit their money to a brand new entry. The once severed Dead Space necromorph might just find its limbs once again.